Good morning to Ontario, Canada. Hello, Jay.
Hello, Lucas.
It's great that you woke up that early for us. Can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. I am Jay Reid. I'm in Guelph, Ontario, Canada. That is traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. And I am president and co-founder of the Making Box. We're all about helping individuals and organizations with adaptability, creativity, collaboration, and joy at work. Our clients include Shopify and Google, and some of these big, large organizations. However, we operate on a buy one, give one program at the Making Box. So organizations get to give a session to people if they work with us. So we also work with charities and nonprofits that these organizations send us to, hospices, things in healthcare, all sorts of places we find ourselves working.
Now, that sounds great. So a variety of clients out there and topics. So what is a typical, if possible, a typical workshop or a typical thing that you offer at Google or at another organization?
Yeah, I would say the most common thing right now is that teams are feeling fractured and they haven't quite figured out how to connect in meaningful human ways and build culture virtually. I think that's something that's new for a lot of teams. And so that's something that we're often asked to help with.
And I assume that improvisation is something that you also use. So to what extent do you use applied improvisation or improvisational theater in your work?
Yeah. I guess maybe I'll kind of like zoom out on that a bit and maybe let you know a little bit about like what improvisation as a whole means to me. And the short answer to that question is a lot. It means a lot to me. It's both an obsession and a profession. And it's something that I've been involved in for more than half my life. And so it's where I've met my partner, it's where I've met many friends, and it's also keeps me employed. So it definitely means a lot to me.
That sounds interesting because I met my wife at an improv workshop 10 years ago. I do understand what you mean. So what is improvisation for you? What does it mean for you if this is so essential and even an obsession for you?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a gym to explore new ways of operating in the world. It's a vehicle to build trust with people rapidly, right? I imagine that accelerated the process with you and your wife, as with my partner and I. It's kind of like someone said that improvising together is sort of like going on 10 dates all at once, right? It really like it really accelerates this process of getting to know each other. There's vulnerability, there's intimacy, there's often eye contact, and things like that. So it definitely accelerates that. And you know, it's kind of a tricky thing to define what improvisation is and what it isn't. I know I was listening in on I Applied Improvisation Network YouTube conference discussion that you were a part of that was all about trying to like define improvisation, where it belonged. And sometimes it's even easier to kind of answer that by talking about what it's not. But I've really stuck with one kind of definition, which is from Patrick Short's Improv for Business book, or maybe slightly paraphrased, but that it's a framework of listening, connecting, and responding that encourages trust, flexibility, and collaboration. And I really like that definition. also been inspired by Miles Davis's definition, which is improv is the freedom and space to hear things, which is another definition that I've been liking and mulling over lately.
I like this definition a lot. And you referred to theater and music. Now, still in organization, people say like, well, you know, we do business here, and it's not about music, it's not about theater, it's about work or
Yes.
or collaboration. So how can you connect these these ideas of improvisational theater or music to a world in which art is not the main product, so to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most efficient way sometimes is to ask people two questions. One is, raise your hand if you feel like you've ever improvised before. And, and usually like 40 to 50% of the group will raise their hand. And then there'll be like 15% of people that go like, and then they'll be like, the rest of the people won't raise their hand at all. Then you ask the second question. Who here has ever had a conversation with a human being before? Right? And your reaction is usually their reaction, right? And so we're coming to the realization that there's so many improvisational components within our lives at work and beyond. And so then we kind of can ask ourselves the question of like, oh, if we're doing so much of this thing, who here has consciously practiced getting good at this? And very few people raise their hand, and they're like, oh, there's an incongruency there. Why aren't we practicing this thing that we're doing so much of?
That reminds me of a conversation with an improv actor, and I was like, what is improvisation? What is improvisation? Why do you need that? And so on. And at the end I asked like, when do you not improvise? And he's like, wait a minute, right? So as you asked the question, like, when do you not improvise? So it seems to be a thing everyone does that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of omnipresent in so many dimensions. And I think that's sort of a blessing and a curse with improvisation, is that it's so slippery of what it is and what it isn't. And you talked about like, how do you bring this into organizations? And when you talk about the word improv, at least in kind of the English language, that's associated with like comedy first and foremost, right? And so I think sometimes the best way to bring the skills of improvisation into workplaces is to not call it improv. Like you set up if you say like, hey, we're going to do an improv act warm up, people are like, oh no, like, like there's such an emotional reaction to that word. Whereas if I said like, we're going to do an activity called mind meld, you'd be like, oh, what is that? Sounds cool. I'm in. Right. So I think the word improv and improvisation are not great. They're not well branded for the corporate world and kind of people's typical expectations of what it is and what it isn't.
Yes. So I think sometimes it's easier to call it differently. For example, collaboration or trust, as you mentioned before. Now, if you use these, you know, mindsets and techniques and so on, how do you train people to collaborate better, to find, you know, a trust relationship, or at the end to improvise better?
Yeah, we often focus on like 5 or 6 kind of key principles that underscore a lot of like the activities that we do. And we generally take a learn by doing approach. You know, let's run through this and then reflect on the experience afterwards. We often like to take a drills focus practice too, you know, kind of like how firefighters, you know, spend most of their time preparing and practicing and training. So when the crisis strikes, when the pressure's on, we can act cool under pressure, right? And I think it was a Greek poet, Archilochus, I think, said like, we don't rise to our expectations, we fall to the level of our training, right? When the pressure's on. So we got to try to take this like drills focused approach, like basketball players, take 1,000,000 free throws. So then when the pressure's on, we can act cool under that pressure of all these unforeseen circumstances. And those principles are usually these like 4 or 5 or 6 things. The idea of noticing more, really like heightening our awareness, reading the room well, being present to the reality, being willing to be changed, the concept and practice of using yes and, treating obstacles as gifts, and then finding the fun, right? Like joy is important. And it's something that we're missing right now. And sometimes it's easy to strip that away and think of it not as an important piece. But I think finding the fun actually is a very important principle.
So I like very much also the metaphor of like basketball, because I also sometimes ask people like, do you want to watch a basketball game that is scripted or that is not scripted? And I think, oh, I'm not interested in a scripted match. It's boring. Like, yes. And you said drill, so you have to drill and train that. So how do you train that? For example, you have a better awareness, or you notice more. I think that was your word.
Yeah.
How do you train that to do so?
Yeah, it's repeating improv activities over and over and over again and making them kind of a ritual and practice about how we regularly operate. And this interests me a lot of like, how do we translate this into a regular practice and take these skills and weave them into our DNA? And we don't really practice things often that we really dislike doing, right? So how can we take a little bit of the element of the fun of improvisation and turn that into kind of some sort of ritual and practice that we do in something that we do already? And so we're going to talk about this lots in our session, which is like, what's the thing that we do a lot of already? Meetings. How can we take some improvisational practice and make it part of our meetings all the time? So then we're constantly flexing those muscles and kind of preparing ourselves for those unforeseen circumstances.
That's very nice, I think, because you said like firefighters, they train all the time. They always have to be prepared for unexpected situations. And the question was like, how do you do that in organizations? Because how do you train? And I think meetings is a very nice way, because this is what often or sometimes too often happens in organizations, and to change that. So how long is such a training, or for how long would you recommend that people train these skills and go to this kind of gym?
Yeah. At the Making Box, we also have training centers. So like brick and mortar locations, one in Guelph where I am, and another city that's just about a half an hour away, Kitchener-Waterloo. And our programs that we had kind of before the pandemic were 8-week, 2-hour programs, and that would be like level 1. And there were 5 of those levels. So that's potentially 40 2-hour improv classes. And as a facilitator, seeing people go through this whole process over like potentially a 6-month period, you really see them shift so greatly and achieve such courage and ability to focus and listen and be present and fail courageously and be themselves, happen through a very long process like that, right? Like any skill, right? It takes a lot of repetition to make it instinctual and part of our daily operating mode. That becomes really tricky when we move into organizations, and not many organizations are willing to be like, yeah, spend 40 hours doing this over the next while, right? So there's that balance is really tricky for us. Most organizations aren't dedicating more than like 4 intervals of practice. And the research shows that humans often underestimate the value of spaced repetition while learning something new, right? So there's kind of opposing pressures sometimes when you move in to bringing improvisation organizationally from a time use perspective.
So what if organizations would understand that this is essential, and they would send, a lot of employees to your courses, and they spend all the hours and weeks in this gym?
Mm-hmm.
What would you think? What would change for the employees in the organization if they really have this training and these exercises over a longer period of time?
Yeah, I think a few things. One, I think that they would be equipped with a lot of new tools to foster relationships better in the virtual space. I think that they would have skills to help their customers be more satisfied when they're interacting with them, and to leave customers with more memorable experiences. I think that they would have a lot of playful practices that they can do on the regular to effectively handle change and unforeseen circumstances, just greater comfort with that. And that is maybe interpersonally and intrapersonally, just massive gains to psychological safety and uncertainty tolerance. I think that they'd also get, I think what I'm discovering more recently is how many wonderful tools there are within improvisation that are good practices for facilitators. And that I meet a lot of people that are incredible facilitators, and their work at present is not within the domains of improvisation. But then I get talking to them more. I'm like, you're amazing at this. Like, what's your secret? And they're like, tons of improv training. Like, it seems like that is like consistently something that really is 1-for-1 in like amazing facilitation. Not 1-for-1, but very common. People that are amazing facilitators have an improvisational training background.